What if Scott Hall has a cold throughout the show, so he's drinking NyQuil? Good evening. I am RJ City, and this is RJ Reads Wrestling Books. We've talked a lot about the wrestlers who write books, but what about the writers who write for the wrestlers who then write about the wrestling? I am, of course, talking about Vince Russo and his book Rope Opera, play on the term soap opera, how WCW killed Vince Russo by Vince Russo. You see, there's him, and there's Mick Foley there, and Sting, and they're threatening him, and he's got 2 layers on, as if to say, I'm cold, what do you want from me? And then on the back, well, there's a lot of words, I'm not going to get into them now, but it was $19.95 US, $22.95 Canadian, which is what I paid for it. The passage tonight has Mr. Russo talking about some wild censorship things that he engaged in the tawdry world of professional wrestling. So we begin. But to get back to TBS. Now, being a Christian, I really want to believe that TBS had higher values than the other networks. But in keeping it real, that just wasn't the case. In the middle of the day, TBS would run those adolescent movies that were nothing less than what we were doing on Nitro and Thunder at 9 o'clock at night. And they weren't only playing the movie once a day, they were playing it 3 times a day. You know how TBS thinks. Wait, let me stop there. No, I don't. What are they thinking when they play the same movie 3 times a day? If they missed Can't Hardly Wait the first time, they have 2 more chances to watch it? Great, but what happens if they watched it the first time? Then you lose that viewer for 4 hours when you're replaying the movie, right? I guess they knew something that I did not. But regardless, how many times can we really watch Jennifer Love Hewitt? Twice. Maybe. Well, probably. However, it wasn't just the movies. In the middle of the day, Roseanne would be swearing at Dan right there at the kitchen table at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But when asked why Roseanne was allowed to curse but not Scott Steiner, I was told because Nitro is original programming. Do you get that? Since Roseanne wasn't an original TBS show, but Nitro was, she was allowed to get away with the stuff that we weren't. Yeah, read that last sentence over a few times and call me when you get it, because I still haven't. Then, to throw yet more kerosene into the open gaping wound, they add Sex and the City to the TBS lineup and play that 16 times a day. Now, you can edit, slice, and dice all you want, but the only way you're going to make Sex and the City an acceptable network broadcast is to cut down to about 6 minutes. That's why it was on HBO, remember? Maybe it shouldn't have been called Standards and Practices, but rather Double Standards and Practices. Man, that whole thing was a mess and so unfair to edit myself, and here's why. We knew we had to play by the rules and we were understood going in, but the only problem was there was no rule book. Week in and week out, I would ask for the guidelines in print, so I knew what we could and couldn't do when I sat down to write the show, but they never supplied me with one, never. And you know why? Because if they did, they couldn't change the rules as the game played on. Every week there were different rules and different regulations. Do you know how hard it is to write a show without knowing what you can and cannot put on that show? And understand, this wasn't about censoring things that would have burned the eyes from the sockets of the children or victims who would have seen it. This is about censoring things that at times were just outright comical. Things that not even I, in my wildest imagination, would have ever deemed as possible as red flags. Let me name a few for you. Number 1, the NyQuil incident. In trying to stay true to their character, we wanted Scott Hall and Kevin Nash to show up to Nitro drunk. Again, in the storyline. Now, with those 2 personalities, we're talking straight comedy here. However, Standards and Practices would not have it. If 2 wrestlers showed up drunk to the show, that wouldn't be a good message for kids. Okay, I can see their point. Aside from the fact that I saw Archie Bunker get drunk on All the Family in 1973 when I was 12, and as unbelievable as this may sound, I wasn't scarred for life. Again, understand that this was a comedy bit. So after I was told this, which of course was a few hours before the show, I had to think on my feet just to make the segment work. So I threw out, hey, what if Scott Hall has a cold throughout the show, so he's drinking NyQuil? He cops a buzz from the NyQuil, not alcohol. I hope you're starting to see how ridiculous this was. The S&P censor who came to every show took a minute to ponder that suggestion. After about 30 seconds, he looked at me and said, yeah, that'll work. So in other words, kids, forget the Jack Daniels. Go out to Walgreens and get some cold medicine. Same result, but cheaper, and you won't get carded. Number 2, the 3 fat ladies. Upon his arrival to the building, Roddy Piper was going to come across 3 overweight, middle-aged women. In hot rod fashion, he was going to rapid-fire insults at them, again in a straight comedic skit. No go, red pencil. According to S&P, Roddy might offend an overweight, middle-aged woman who might be watching our show. Yes, this really happened. Number 3, Kimberly slips Rick a Mickey. Without remembering the exact setup, there are a lot of things I've wanted to forget and have forgotten about. We wrote a skit, you see. It was a skit, Wrestling Isn't Really Real, where Kimberly Page would slip a Mickey into Ric Flair's cocktail in order to knock him out cold. Now, whereas Kimberly was allowed to do that, we just weren't allowed to show her do that. What? Tell me, and we'll both know. Number 4, the Radicals and the American flag. In an effort to help Hacksaw Jim Duggan's story over, we wrote a skit where the Radicals were going to burn the American flag. However, before they completed their dastardly deed, Hacksaw would save the flag and the day, Rick Monday style. You have to know baseball to understand that reference. However, even though the proud patriot was successful in foiling their plot, the heels would get heat on him, then cover his body with the American flag in the middle of the ring. Standards and practices said that's a no-go. Curious Vince, why? Matter-of-fact standards and practices, because there might be a veteran watching our show who gets offended by this. You see, these were all the vile, obscene, dirty things that Vince Russo wanted to do at WCW that S&P simply would not allow. Now, as a Christian, there is something that I truly want you to understand. All those horrific things I did at the WWF and wanted to do at WCW, many of which I looked at as strictly comedy. Yes, even the Mark Henry incident with the transvestites, but not the hand. I had nothing to do with that butte. I did to draw ratings, period. It wasn't about me or what I liked. It was about what people would watch. It was our job to feed them what they wanted. Plain and simple. You have to remember, at the time, I was in my mid to late 30s. Do you think at that age, with 3 children and a wife, the same wife for 2 decades, that I really got excited over bra and panties matches? Come on, I didn't. But I knew a large percentage of our audience did. So I shovel-fed them, and they ate. Yes, I was guilty of making this place worse than it already is. And I did it for the money. But don't take my word for it.
Guests of the RJ City Show, subscribe to his channel, follow him on social media, and buy his t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com/RJ City.